This is a recording of Megan reading The Tortilla Curtain by T.C. Boyle, Part 3, entitled Socorro, which means help or relief. And I want you to think about, why is this the title of Part 3? Guess. Guess now, make a prediction, and then when we're done with the book, answer it again once we finish it. I'm going to be reading chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Part 3. Chapter 1. So you can follow along. You can follow along. I will try to make this as steady as possible. And I have some vocabulary for you to write down, and I will be asking you some questions. And when I say note this, you may want to take some notes, because any notes that you take while I'm reading this, you can use on the quiz on Monday. If you, okay. So chapter 1. But it's only a couple of blocks, Delaney was saying to the steamed-over bathroom mirror, while Kira moved behind him in the bedroom, trying on clothes. He'd towel-dried his hair now. He'd towel-dyed his hair, and now he was shaving. Even with the hallway door closed, he could smell the turkey. The entire house alive with the aroma of roasting bird, an aroma that took him back to his childhood and his grandparents' sprawling apartment in Yonkers. Remember, he's from out east, and Yonkers is in New York. The medley of smells that would hit him in the stairwell and grow increasingly potent with each step of the 3 flights up, until it exploded when the door swung open to reveal his grandmother standing there in her apron. Nothing had ever smelled so good. No French bakery in the first hour of light, no restaurant, no barbecue or clam bake. It seems ridiculous to take the car. Kira appeared in the bathroom doorway. She was in a black slip, and she'd put her hair up. "Hurry, can't you?" she said. "I need the mirror." "And yes, we're taking the car. Of course we're taking the car. With this wind, my hair would be all over the place." Jordan was in the living room, occupied with the tape-delayed version of the Macy's parade. Orbelina was scrambling to set the table and clean up the culinary detritus in the kitchen. Detritus is your first vocabulary word. Detritus. And Kira's mother, Kit, was in the guest room freshening up. Delaney cracked the blinds. The day was clear, hot, wind-driven. "You've got a point," he conceded. Back then he'd always worn a suit, tie, and overcoat, even when he was 5 or 6, as the yellowed black and white photos testified, but those were more formal times. Plus, it was cold. There'd be ice on the lakes now, and the wind off the Hudson would have a real bite to it. What's the Hudson that he's talking about? But what to wear today? To Dominic Flood's cocktail party. Delaney sank his face into the towel, padded into the bedroom on bare feet, and pushed through the things in his closet. This was California, after all. You could wear hip boots and a top hat, and nobody would blink twice. He settled finally on a pair of baggy white cotton trousers and a short-sleeved sport shirt Kira had bought him. The shirt carved alternate patches of white and burgundy across his chest and over his shoulders, and in each burgundy patch the multiplied figures of tiny white jockeys leapt, genuflected, and gamboled their way through a series of obscure warm-up exercises. It was California all the way. There must have been 100 people at Dominic Flood's. 2:00 in the afternoon, umbrellas flapping over the tables set up in the backyard. A string quartet was stationed under the awning that shaded the den, and the awning was flapping too. Most of the guests were packed in near the bar, where 2 men in tuxedos and red ties were manipulating bottles with professional ease. To the left of the bar, along the interior wall and running the length of the room, was a table laden with enough food for 6 Thanksgiving feasts, including a whole roast suckling pig with a mango in its mouth and fresh steamed lobsters, surrounded by multicolored platters of sashimi and sushi. Remember the the food, the abundance of food, even here at Dominic Flood's, where they have enough for 6 Thanksgiving feasts. Dominic himself, resplendent in a white linen suit that flared at the ankle to hide the little black box on loan from the Los Angeles County Electronic Monitoring Service stood just inside the door, greeting guests, a long stemmed glass in his hand. Delaney maneuvered Kira and her mother through the crowd to introduce them. "Ah, Delaney!" Dominic cried, taking his hand theatrically, even as he shifted his attention to Kira and her mother. "And this must be Mrs. Mossbacher. And Kit," Kira's mother put in, taking Flood's hand. "Kit Menaker. I'm visiting from San Francisco." The string quartet started up then, sawing harshly into something jangling and modern, their faces strained against the rush of wind and the indifferent clamor of the party, and Delaney tuned out the conversation. Kira's mother, 55, blonde and divorced, with Kira's nose and legs and an exaggerated self-presence, was the single most coquettish woman Delaney had ever known. Coquettish. There's another one of your vocab words. Coquettish, describing Kira's mother. What does that mean? She would tangle herself like a vine round Dominic Flood, whose incipient bachelorhood she could smell out in some uncanny extrasensory way. Incipient is another one. INCIPIENT. And she would almost certainly invite him to their little dinner party, only to be disappointed and maybe even a bit shocked by the black manacle on his ankle. And that, of course, would only whet her appetite. Why? Why would it whet her appetite? "Yes," he heard Kira say, "but I was just a little girl then." And Kit chimed in with a high, breathless giggle that was like a war cry. What does he mean by that? Her war cry. Delaney excused himself and drifted off toward the food, picking at a few things here and there. He never could resist a bite of ahi tuna or a spicy scallop roll if it was good, and this was very good, the best, but pacing himself for the feast to come. Remember, they're having a dinner party at his house later tonight. He smiled at a stranger or two, murmured an apology when he jostled a woman over the carcass of the pig, exchanged sound bites about the weather, and watched the bartender pour him a beer, but all the while he was fretting. He kept envisioning the turkey going up in flames, the potatoes congealing into something like wet concrete, Jordan sinking into boredom and distracting Orbelina with incessant demands for chocolate milk, pudding, cup of noodles, a drink of juice. And their guests, he hadn't yet seen the Jardines or the Cherrystones, though he could hear Jack Cherrystone's booming basso profundo from somewhere out on the back lawn. What is basso profundo? Remember Jack Cherrystone's voice. What does that mean? But he was sure they'd fill up here and push their plates away at dinner. Delaney wasn't very good at enjoying himself, not in a situation like this, and he stood there in the middle of the crush for a moment, took a deep breath, let his shoulders go slack, and swung his head from side to side to clear it. He was feeling lost and edgy, and maybe even a bit guilty to be imbibing so early in the afternoon. Imbibing means drinking, even on a day dedicated to self-indulgence like this one. When he felt a pressure at his elbow and turned to see Jack, Erna, and Jack Jr. arrayed in smiling wonder behind him. "Delaney!" Jack sang out, holding on to the last syllable as if he couldn't let it go. "You look lost." Jack was dressed. Three-piece suit, crisp white button-down shirt, knotted tie. His wife, a cat-like bosomy woman who always insisted on the two-cheek continental style of greeting and would clutch your shoulders with tiny fists until she'd been accommodated, as she did now, was dressed. Delaney saw that she was wearing a shroud-like evening gown, black satin, and at least 60% of her jewelry collection. Even Jack Jr., with his high tops, earrings, and ridiculous haircut, was dressed in a sport coat that accented the new spread of his shoulders, and a tie he must have inherited from his father. "I am lost," Delaney admitted. He hefted the beer and grinned. "It's too early in the afternoon for me to be drinking. You know me and alcohol, Jack, and I've got a 6-course dinner to worry about, which you're going to love, by the way. Old New England right here in California. Or old New York, anyway." "Relax, Delaney," Erna purred. It's Thanksgiving. Enjoy the party." Jack Jr. gave him a sick grin. He stood a head taller than anyone else in the room, His voice cracked when he excused himself and drifted toward the suckling pig, like some incubus of the food chain. Incubus. Incubus. Check that one out. I see from the letters this month you've been taking some heat on that coyote column, Jack said, and a glass of wine seemed to materialize magically in his hand. Erna grinned at Delaney, waved at someone over his shoulder. Remember the coyote column that he wrote about how the coyotes are natural predators and the humans are kind of invading their territory. Leave it to Jack to bore right in. Delaney shrugged. Yeah, I guess so. There have been something like 30 letters. Most of them are critical, but not all. But that's something. I must have pushed some buttons. Actually, the response had surprised him. He'd never provoked, more than half a dozen letters before, all from literal-minded biologists taking issue with his characterization of the dusky-footed wood rat or his use of the common name of some plant in preference to the scientific. The readers, die-hard preservationists to the last man, woman, and child, had seemed to feel he was advocating some sort of control on coyote populations, and though he'd been upset over Osbert when he wrote the piece, he didn't see the column as being at all environmentally incorrect. After the 10th letter had come in, he'd sat down and reread the column, twice, and there was nothing there. They just weren't getting it. They weren't reading it in the spirit it was intended. He wasn't pushing for population controls. Controls were futile, and the historical record proved it, as he'd indicated. He was just elucidating the problem, opening up the issue to debate. Elucidating. Elucidating. Certainly it wasn't the coyotes that were to blame. It was us. Hadn't he made that clear? Jack was grinning, his lips ever so slightly drawn back to reveal a strategic flash of enamel. Delaney recognized the expression. It was skeptical, faintly ironic, meant to convey to judges, jurors, and district attorneys alike that the issue had yet to be decided. So what is it, Delaney? Should we bring back the traps and quotas or not? You've lost 2 dogs, and how many others here have lost pets too? He made a sweeping gesture to take in the room, the house, the community at large. That's right, Kira said, slipping up behind Delaney and taking hold of his arm. And that's where we had our falling out over the wall. Or actually, it was war, full on, no holds barred. Jack laughed. Erna laughed. Delaney managed a rueful smile as greetings went round and the string quartet built to a frenzy in the confuoco. Rueful. What does that mean? Rueful. But really, Kira said, unwilling to let it go, don't you feel safer now, all of you? Jack, Erna, Delaney, don't you? She said, turning her face to him. Admit it. Delaney reddened, which means what? What does that mean if he's describing him as reddened? Shrugged again. The beer glass in his hand was heavy as a cannonball. I know when I'm licked, he was saying. But Erna Jardine had already leapt in to answer for him. Of course we do, she said. We all do. The wall's barely been completed, and yet I'm breathing easier to know there'll never be another rattlesnake in my garage, or another break-in. She gave them a pious look, which means like a religious look. Oh, I know that doesn't mean we can let our guard down, but still, it's one more barrier, isn't it? She said. What is she referring to? Another barrier. What other barriers have we had in this story? And then she leaned into Kira and lowered her voice confidentially. Did you hear about Shelley Shurek? It was a follow-home, right down the hill in Calabasas. The party went on. Delaney fretted, had a second beer. Jack Cherrystone joined them and gave a farcical synopsis of a movie he'd just done the trailer for. Farcical. What does that mean? Farcical. Yet another apocalyptic futuro-cyberpunk vision of Los Angeles in the 21st century. People gathered round when he shifted from the merely thunderous tones of his everyday voice to the mountain-toppling hysteria of the one he wielded professionally. They broke her babies, he roared. Ate their young. Made love an irredeemable sin. Jack's eyes bugged out. He shook his jowls and waved his hands as if he'd dipped them in oil. It was a real performance, all of that voice pouring out of so small a vessel, and Delaney found himself laughing till he felt something uncoil inside him. Overcooked turkeys, mucilaginous potatoes, and other culinary disasters notwithstanding. What do you think that means? Mucilaginous. Something to do with those potatoes that had congealed earlier in his mind. He finished the second beer and wondered if he should have a third. So he's starting to loosen up, starting to feel a little more comfortable. That must have been about 4 p.m. Delaney couldn't place the time exactly in the frantic sequence of events that followed. Oh, there's some foreshadowing. Frantic sequence of events that followed. We can guess because we know what has happened to Candido and America, what's going on with them. But he remembered looking at his watch about then and thinking he had to excuse himself soon if there was any hope of serving dinner by 6. And then the sirens went off, and the first of the helicopters sliced overhead, and someone jumped up on one of the tables in the backyard and shouted, "Fire! Fire in the canyon!" What are the helicopters for? Maybe I should turn this way. That might be easier to read it then. Kira had been enjoying herself. Delaney might have looked constipated, wearing what she liked to think of as his night before the exams face, sweating the little details of their dinner party, the firmness of the turkey, the condition of the silverware, and God knew what else. But she was kicking back, not a care in the world. Everything's under control, she kept telling him. Don't worry. She'd had everything organized for days, right down to the last detail. All it would take was to reheat a few things in the microwave and uncork the wines. This way. She already finished her run for the day and swum 40 laps too, in anticipation of taking on a few superfluous calories. Can you guess what that means? Superfluous? Superfluous. The flowers were cut and arranged, the turkey was in the oven, and Orbelina was more than capable of handling any little emergency that might arise. And while she could have been out showing houses, holidays were always hot, even Thanksgiving, though among holidays it ranked next to last, just ahead of Christmas. She figured she deserved a break. When you worked 10 and 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and sat by the telephone on the 7th, and hadn't taken a real vacation in 5 years, not even for your honeymoon, you had to give something back to your family and yourself. Her mother was here. Her sister was on the way. She was giving a dinner party. It was time to relax. Besides, she'd always been curious about Dominic Flood. Erna was forever dropping his name, and there was always something hushed and secretive about the whole business. His conviction, the anklet he had to wear, his wife leaving him, and though he was known to entertain frequently, what else could he do? Kira had never met him till now, or been inside the house either. She had to admit she was favorably impressed. The house was tasteful, nothing splashy or showy, quintessentially southwestern, with a few really fine details like the Talavera tiles in the kitchen, set off by a pair of ancient retablos depicting a saint at prayer, and it was interesting to see what he'd done with a floor plan identical to theirs. And the man himself had proven to be no disappointment either, oozing charm, and with something dangerous in his eyes, the way he glanced at you, the easy crackle of his voice. He'd made one convert, at least. Her mother hadn't left his side since they got there. It was a pity he couldn't come to dinner. Kira found herself drifting easily from group to group, almost as much at home as if it were her own party. She knew at least half the people here, and was curious about the ones she didn't know. Dominic's friends from outside Arroyo Blanco. In the same way she was curious about him. If she'd expected gangster types or little Milkins or whatever, she was disappointed. There wasn't a crack in the facade. She talked to a couple from Brentwood about cacti, 19th century Japanese prints, property values, and yachts. and to a muddled, bespectacled man in his 30s who seemed to be some sort of scholar devoted to plowing through ancient manuscripts of the Vatican, though to what purpose she never determined. And then there was the group of three, two sisters and the husband of the chunkier of the two, or was it the slimmer, who kept urging her to refill her wine glass, though one was her limit, and with whom she discussed tennis, Nohutlan figurines, property values, and the North American Free Trade Agreement. There wasn't a capo or consigliere in sight. What do you think those mean? CAPO or CONISGLIERE. She refilled her glass with Evian and was huddled over the canapes with Erna and Selda Cherrystone, her own little party beginning to splinter off, though her mother was still across the room monopolizing their host, and she was feeling good, really good, for the first time in a long while. Real estate was off her mind for the day at least, though the rest of the weekend would be full bore, the last really big weekend of the season, people trying to get in on a 30-day escrow before Christmas. And the DeRose place was locked and shuttered and secured for the holiday. She hadn't told anybody yet, Delaney or Jordan, that is, but now that the wall was up and their troubles behind them, she was thinking, just thinking, of another dog, a Sheltie maybe, for Jordan's birthday. That would bring things full circle. That would start the healing. She looked out the window and the sun was a golden, beneficent thing. What does beneficent mean? I think we've had that one before. Beneficent. The rich green shining leaves of the camellias steeped in it, and she saw in a moment of clarity that it was a thing to reverence and enjoy, the realtor's greatest ally, and she forgot the winds, the late heat, the mad, parched, thirsty air rushing through the canyon for the sea, forgot all about it, until someone got up on a table and shouted, "Fire!" and the day fell to pieces around her. Delaney was no alarmist, but with the first blast of the sirens, he couldn't help but think of Jordan, alone, back at the house. I thought their maid was with him. He found himself out on the lawn at Dominic Flood's with all the rest of the partygoers, staring into the twisting column of black smoke that rose ominously from the canyon below. There was no need for panic, not yet. Brush fires broke out routinely up here, and half the time the fire department had them squelched in a matter of hours. And yet the brush was ready to explode, and everyone knew it. No one better than Delaney. He looked around him at the anxious faces of his neighbors, their necks craning, mouths drawn tight, a cold, vestigial glint of fear frozen in the depths of their eyes. Vestigial. Vestigial. What does that mean? They'd survived last year's firestorms and the quake, too, and the mudslides, for that matter, and no one wanted to get hysterical. No one wanted to risk looking foolish. Not yet. Not yet. Still, Delaney found himself edging back through the crowd. "Sorry, excuse me, please. Sorry," until he found Kira and took hold of her arm. "Honey, we better go. I mean, just in case," he said, and already you could smell the smoke, metallic and bitter, and her eyes widened, and she breathed a single word, "Jordan." They just got in the car when the wind shifted and the muscular black column of smoke stood up straight in the sky and closed a fist over the sun. Kit was in the back seat, miffed, dismayed, and thoroughly ruffled, the Menaker groove etched deeply into the flesh between her eyebrows. Delaney had actually had to pry her hand away from the crook of Dominic Flood's arm. "I can't really see what all the fuss is about," she said petulantly. 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 "We have brush fires all the time in the Bay Area, and they just come in with those planes and snuff them right out." As if on cue, the first of the bombers roared overhead and dropped its pink cloud of flame retardant into the cauldron below. Delaney said nothing. They'd almost been evacuated last fall, were right on the verge of it, but the main arm of the firestorm had passed 2 or 3 miles behind them, on the far side of the ridge, and the secondary fire had burned its way up the canyon on a collision course with Arroyo Blanco, until the wind shifted and it fell back into the wasteland it had just created. 18,000 acres had burned, and 350 homes were lost. 3 people died. By the time Delaney reached the driveway, the sun was gone. He backed the car in and left it there, ready for a quick escape if it came to that. The turkey smell hit him as he entered the house, but all the nostalgia it had dredged up earlier was gone now, and he told himself to stay calm. It was probably nothing, as Jordan came wheeling down the hall, hollering, "Mommy, Delaney, there's a fire!" And Orbelina appeared from the kitchen to give them all a quick, anxious look. Kira bent to hug her son while her own mother looked on bewildered, as if she'd just washed her hands and couldn't find a towel to dry them. No one seemed to know what to do. Was the party on or off? Was the fire just a little thing, a minor inconvenience that would add piquancy, piquancy, to the day and provide a few after-dinner jokes? Or were their lives in danger? Their home, everything they owned? Kira lifted her eyes to Delaney, and he was aware in that moment that they were all watching him. His wife, her mother, the maid, and Jordan, looking for signals, waiting for him to act, seize the moment, take the bull by the horns. That was when he crossed the room and flicked on the TV, and there it was, the fire, roiling in bright orange beauty, mesmerizing, seductive, the smoke unraveling round the edges as if whole empires were aflame. Notice how he describes the fire here as something beautiful, something mesmerizing and seductive. Why does he describe it that way? What's been your experience with fire? Think about that. They all stood there in silence while the camera pulled back to show the bombers diving on the flames and the helicopters hovering with a tinny televised clatter that mocked the booming vibrations overhead. And a voice that couldn't suppress a secret thrill said, "Driven by Santa Ana winds, the blaze, which officials now think began along the bed of Topanga Creek, just below Fernwood, less than an hour ago, was at first headed toward the Pacific Coast Highway, and all residents of the Lower Canyon are being evacuated. But as you can see from our dramatic helicopter footage, the winds have just now shifted, and the main body of the fire seems to be climbing toward the populated area around Topanga Village." That was all Kira needed to hear. "Load up the cars," she cried, and though she was still standing in place, her movements were frantic, as if she were a conductor urging the full orchestra to a crescendo. "I want the photo albums, if nothing else. And Jordan, you pack clothes, hear me? Clothes first, and then you can take video games." "All right," Delaney heard himself saying, and his voice was a desperate gulp for air. "And what should I take? The electronics, I guess. The computer? My books?" Kit sank heavily into the armchair, her gaze fixed on the TV and the glorious billowing orange-red seduction of the flames. She glanced up at Delaney, at Kira, at the grim, uncomprehending face of the maid. She was dressed in a champagne suit with a frilly mauve blouse and matching heels, her hair perfectly coiffed, makeup flawless. Is it really that serious? No one had moved. Not yet. Not yet. They all turned back to the TV, hoping for a reprieve, hoping that they'd been watching old footage, color-enhanced pictures of the Dresden bombing, anything but the real and actual. But there it was, the fire, in living color, and there the familiar studio set and the anchor persons, so familiar they might have been family. The anchor persons were clucking and grieving and admonishing, straining their prototypic features to hear the dramatic eyewitness testimony of a reporter standing on the canyon road with his wind-blown hair and handheld mic. Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, this was the real thing. Oh yes, indeed. There's another vocab word for you. Prototypic. Prototypic. Kira looked as if she were about to lift off and shoot through the ceiling. Orbelina, whose English was limited to a response to the 6 or 7 most common scullery commands, stared at the screen in disbelief. No doubt thinking about her apartment in Pacoima and how she was going to get there if the buses weren't running. And this meant the buses wouldn't be running, didn't it? Jordan clung to his mother's leg. He was staring fascinated at the televised flames, his mother's admonition to pack already forgotten. And Kit, though she sank even more deeply into the folds of the chair, still didn't seem to understand. "But they haven't told us to evacuate," she protested weakly. "I mean, no one said a word about the upper canyon. Did they?" "We better shut off the turkey," Delaney said, and that seemed to lift the spell. "Just in case." Oh, and that's the end of the chapter. Okay, excellent. So, write down some notes. What's going on with these people? What are they afraid of? What are they most concerned about? And compare them to America and Candido's situation. Chapter 2 will be coming up soon.